anderthalb und doppelte bedeuten. Auf einer Frontlänge wie gigantisches und einem Gegner gegenüber, der, das muss ich hier aussprechen, nicht aus Menschen besteht, sondern aus Tieren, aus Bestien.
In the icy Russian tundra, the Nazis sought to establish a grim destiny for the people of the Soviet Union. The options were only two: the ruthless choice between slavery or annihilation. After the Second World War, history has not yet dealt with this chapter, as bloody as it is unknown. The magnitude of the horrors unleashed by the Nazi invasion of the Soviets and the fateful confrontation that began in 1941, a dark story of suffering, where the destiny of a nation was on the edge of brutality and destruction. In today's video, we are going to share with you the history of the Nazi enterprise known as Operation Barbarossa. We will try to give you details of how this offensive was carried out, but we will emphasize the atrocious and savage behaviors of the German and Soviet soldiers. This was a contest in which there was no place for humanity, and the battlefield was completely bloodthirsty. Prepare for a journey to the cold lands of the USSR, where the bones of the innocent crunched under the march of two armies determined to destroy the enemy. Welcome once again to military history. In the early 1940s, the curtain of history opened to reveal one of the darkest and most brutal episodes of the 20th century: the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa, from its first stages, was a symphony of unparalleled savagery. It was conceived as a war determined to subject tens of millions of Russians to slavery and exterminate the Judeo-Bolshevik enemy, as Hitler called him. In a heroic feat of resistance, the Soviet people rose like a colossus against an implacable German tide, an epic opposition that changed the course of the war, but left a heartbreaking trail. Countless millions of soldiers and civilians sacrificed their lives for freedom and survival. Decades after this fateful chapter, splinters remain not only of the brutal confrontation, but also of the unfathomable price that the Soviet people paid. A story of bravery, sacrifice, and pain, where the Russian nation faced the darkness of the Third Reich with the hope of a future, freed from the chains of totalitarianism. This confrontation generated a tragic outcome, since the troops of the Soviet Union ended up adopting the cruelty and savagery of the Nazis to combat the enemy. Decades after the development of Operation Barbarossa, vast collections of transcribed testimonies from hundreds of survivors of the brutal Nazi occupation emerged from Soviet archives. The fruit of historians who followed the Red Army during its march of liberation or reconquest, these transcripts were meticulously compiled between 1943 and 1944. Delving into devastated cities and towns in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, these historians sat down with eyewitnesses, recording in shorthand each word. Among those interviewed were several Jews who miraculously managed to survive. An actress from Kiev threw herself into the Babi Yar ravine just before the executioner's bullets hit her. She remained in the well for hours, soaked in the blood of her fellow Jews, pretending to be dead, then crawling into the safety of the night and escaping it. For the next 2 years, she subsisted as a wanderer in a hostile land until she was finally rescued by strange allies. Despite her diverse origins, practically all witnesses agreed in defining the German government as inhumane and extremely cruel. To corroborate the actress's story, we will share the testimony of a man who suffered an equally serious and terrifying situation. The event, narrated by the Jewish refugee, who at the time of the story was just a child, is truly shocking. Let's listen firsthand to the event that, we warn, can chill the blood of the most sensitive.
Mi padre me abrazó y me puso las manos en la nuca. Las ametralladoras empezaron a... y yo caí. Recuerdo lo que sentí entonces. Mi madre me empujó. Yo caí y él me cayó encima. Creo que me cayó encima. No le vi cayendo, pero estaba encima de mí. Estaba encima, abrazándome, y escupiendo sangre. Tras unos segundos, dejó de moverse.
On an almost inconceivable scale, the battle on the Eastern Front during World War II became a colossal whirlwind of destruction. Over the course of 4 years from 1941, 5 million German soldiers would lose their lives in a vast battlefield, while many more would be captured. However, what made this contest unique was not only the magnitude of the forces at play, but also the unprecedented brutality that marked the fight. It was a bloody clash between the Eastern Slavs and the Western Aryans, an epic battle fueled by the ideological struggle between German Nazism and Soviet Bolshevism. In this cruel confrontation, both sides regarded each other as beasts destined to be slaughtered without mercy, abandoning all notions of mercy or humanity. In the early hours of June 23, 1941, a storm of artillery fire raged over a 2,000-kilometer front, marking the beginning of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Armored and motorized divisions attacked defenses on enemy soil, while bomber planes attacked Soviet airfields and naval bases.
Only a few weeks later, German fighter planes dominate Soviet airspace. Despite clear warnings, the Red Army is not ready for action. The invaders are confident of victory. Along a broad front, the Wehrmacht occupies the Ukraine, White Russia, and the Baltic states.
The Wehrmacht had gathered more than 3 million soldiers for what would become the most powerful military assault in history. Operation Barbarossa, taking its name from a medieval German emperor, was much more than just a war. Hitler conceived it as a colossal confrontation between two rival ideologies for global supremacy: Nazism, with its Aryan superiority, and Soviet communism, or as he called it, Judeo-Bolshevism, which the Führer saw as brute beasts. For the Nazis, communism was a lethal weapon forged by Jewish intellectuals to harm the most developed races, in particular, the German people. For Germany to prosper, communism had to be eradicated. Hitler made it clear to his generals that this contest would not follow traditional military conventions. The communist is not a comrade before or after. This is a war of extermination. Racializing its enemy in the East as an inferior Asian Jewish force, the Third Reich justified extreme cruelty. German soldiers, according to the decrees of the High Command, had to ignore the international standards of war conduct that Germany respected in other theaters of war. The invasion of the Soviet Union was prepared in maximum secrecy, with the objective of annihilating in a single blow the country with which, paradoxically, Germany had signed a non-aggression pact. Hitler, urging his generals to fight a battle of annihilation, made it clear that murder, systematic rape, and looting were not only permitted, but actively encouraged by Nazi generals. German tanks broke through the Red Army defenses and retreated over the trenches to bury their occupants alive. The luckiest Soviet prisoners of war were shot, while the others were left without food, with no choice but to resort to cannibalism or starvation. Fleeing civilians were massacred without a moment's hesitation, with shelling or machine guns. In addition, 500,000 Jews who lived on the borders were trapped in the middle of the conflict and were easy prey for the most bloodthirsty Nazis. Behind the German front line advancing rapidly into the heart of Russia were specialized SS killing groups that cruelly dealt with these villages. They hanged communist officials and took Jewish men, women, and children to execution pits where they were unceremoniously killed. However, going east became Hitler's biggest strategic mistake. The Führer assumed that it was going to be a quick victory, estimating a fight of 4 weeks or even less. He thought that a demoralized Red Army, plagued, according to him, by the cancer of Marxism, would give in to his elite troops. But as we will see, the reality turned out to be very different.
Our superiors told us time and again that the Russians were subhuman, uneducated, so the Russians were given short shrift. And we were also told that we'd be home by the end of December, in time for Christmas.
In the midst of chaos and looming threat, the Soviets found a lifeline in coercion and fear. The commissars remained relentless behind the defensive lines, shooting mercilessly at those who retreated in fear from the impressive Russian resistance. However, what was crucial was the resurgence of ancient patriotism, present in the blood that ran through all the inhabitants of Soviet soil. Mother Russia was under an existential threat, and soldiers, civilians, men, women, and even children united in defense of what quickly became popularly dubbed the Great Patriotic War. The renowned Lieutenant Mikhail Alexeyev urged ordinary Russian citizens with a phrase that would be printed in history books: "If you can wield a weapon, be it a shovel or a pitchfork, attack the Germans with it. Kill a Nazi and save the homeland." It didn't take long for Hitler to discover that nothing unites a divided people more than an invasion of his country. The patriotic rhetoric resonated in the hearts of the Soviets with unexpected results. Although key cities such as Leningrad and Stalingrad were on the verge of collapse, they proudly held out despite massive losses. In the midst of the fierce battles, it was not surprising that the Russian front was the most feared destination for German soldiers. This was the turning point. From that moment on, Hitler's forces began to put themselves strictly on the defensive. The front line would oscillate in a constant back and forth between attacks and counterattacks, while both armies, with the Germans outnumbered 2-1, faced each other like crazed fighters, without mercy. The fury of the conflict on the Eastern Front raged with unprecedented brutality. Convinced that all Soviet Jews were carriers of the Bolshevik plague, the Nazi invaders directed their wrath especially at them. In moments of strong resistance, police leaders instinctively blamed Jews, creating a poisonous narrative of connection between partisans and Jews. A case in point was the city of Kyiv, which became the scene of a brutal massacre in retaliation for a Soviet attack. In just 2 days, 33,171 Jewish men, women, and children were executed in the Babi Yar ravine. The SS justified these atrocities, claiming that all Jews were servants of Soviet Bolshevism. Even if that statement were true, nothing justifies the atrocities carried out by the German troops. There is no ideological difference that excuses throwing old people, infants, and pregnant women alive off a cliff and finishing off those who were left dying by throwing a grenade at them. German rage was not limited only to the Jews, but spread to Soviet soldiers, considered infected by Bolshevism. The lack of foresight to build barracks or distribute food to captured hostages revealed an implacable policy. Nazi troops were ordered not to share food with captives, and any attempt to assist civilians would be punished by death. Russian prisoners of war were treated as mortal enemies, compared to wild animals, and subjected to inhumane conditions. Their policy of eliminating the supposed Bolshevik threat was brutally effective. More than 2 million Soviet war hostages died before 1942, forced to starve, contract diseases, and suffer innovative murder methods that we will review in detail later. The war against communism persisted with constant ferocity. The German defeat at Stalingrad in 1943 marked a turning point, but violence continued. At the retaking of Kharkov, German soldiers encountered wounded men in a Soviet hospital and responded with a merciless massacre, killing not only the wounded troops, but also the doctors and nurses on the scene. In the lands occupied by the Germans during Operation Barbarossa, a brutal method of discipline was established: public punishment through violent flogging. Testimonies from locals describe how the Nazis hit workers with their rifles for insufficient greetings or for keeping their hands in their pockets. Furthermore, hangings of suspected partisans and bandits were common, and according to contemporary evidence, the Germans carried out tens of thousands. The Führer's troops hung people from railings, posts, and trees, leaving their bodies on display for weeks to terrorize the population as they rotted. The spoiled meat further terrified the locals. The testimonies highlight that everyone was forced by the Nazi troops to look at these corpses.
Then when it was quiet already, so he came out and we saw a lot of people dead, neighbors because they were running. You know, they didn't know what to do, where to cover themselves. So a lot of people, neighbors, were dead, killed.
In some cases, hangings were carried out in especially degrading ways by Germans belonging to the most evil SS forces. A kolkhoz president from the Tula region described the hanging of an unjustly accused woman in a dark way. They executed her in the following way. They stripped her naked, grabbed her chin with a hook and hung her. She screamed for 4 days as she lay dying, and her relatives were forced to watch. For his part, a Belarusian partisan, interviewed in December 1942, spoke of the gallows installed in squares, parks, and in front of theaters. He reported that these types of devices were set up in all districts and villages, confirming that prisoners were hung with hooks in their jaws, as if they were fish. Some other examples of mistreatment were reported by a young woman from Chernigov. The girl described a scene in which she was taken as a slave by Nazi troops. They stripped us naked and lined us up, and potential employers walked around hitting us on the back with a cane and groping us as well. We are faced with a horrible sight. The Germans looked at us as if we were animals. The evidence of the atrocities perpetrated was overwhelming and heartbreaking. A tank commander returned to his village in Ukraine only to receive the devastating news that his wife and 2 children had been locked in a barn, which was soaked in gasoline, and then set on fire by SS troops for fun. To a large extent, Soviet men and women had already borne a considerable burden of violence in their lives before the war. From the bloody civil war to the brutal collectivization campaign and subsequent famine, the Russian people endured difficult times. With recurring waves of arrests in the 1920s and 1930s, millions of people suffered the consequences of a violent regime. Despite this history of suffering, Soviet witnesses agree that the violence inflicted by the German occupiers during the war was unprecedented, marked by its degrading nature, generating an equally virulent response. The Germans, displaying cynical cruelty, even carried out a form of germ warfare, as a British historian reveals. In Belarus, they detained nearly 50,000 civilians, including many children, forcing them to march at gunpoint into fields of barbed wire and swampy areas. In these camps, 2,000 sick patients were brought with the intention of infecting civilians with typhoid fever. When the Germans withdrew, they left behind a muddy area strewn with the dead and dying. The strategy was that the Soviet soldiers who came to free them would also become infected. These shocking evidence of the massacre and torture inflicted on their people inflamed the spirit of the Russian army. A Soviet captain urged his shipmates to show no mercy. Show no mercy to those German bastards, grind them into pulp. It was in this mood that the Red Army advanced westward, crossed the Vistula River through Poland, and breached Germany's borders for the first time in January 1945. Many of them descended into a violent frenzy of authorized revenge attacks. Officially,
И вот мой взвод собственный, все мои солдаты бросаются и насилуют немок. Когда на спасение дети, матерей пытаются спасти, их застреливают. Их расстреливают, детей. Значит, теперь...
a Soviet soldier remembers asking a general what the Germans who had invaded his lands were allowed to do. The answer was overwhelming. And so they did. They shot unarmed civilians, threw grenades into basements where women and children were sheltering, and even tortured and massacred soldiers who had already surrendered. Among other savage actions, a tank commander deliberately ran over a group of refugees, while a fighter pilot unapologetically admitted to strafing columns of fleeing civilians, turning thousands into minced meat, in his own words. In a perverse twist, the rampant escalation of violence turned out to be beneficial for the Nazis. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's master of propaganda, took advantage of the Red Army's atrocities to persuade hesitant Germans not to consider negotiation or surrender, but to continue the fight to the bitter end. Thus, the war on the Eastern Front, which broke out with unprecedented bloodshed in human history, came to a tragic end 4 years after it began, amid a sea of unparalleled horrors. Soviet losses reached a staggering 27 million, with 2/3 of them civilians. For their part, the Germans had a death toll of at least 5 million. These numbers underscore the exorbitant price paid in this ruthless contest. The war on the Eastern Front was characterized by inhumanity and unrestrained brutality, marking a dark chapter in the history of military battles of the 20th century. This is how we are finishing today's video. We thank you for reaching the end, and we look forward to seeing you in the next installments of military history.